Do you condemn that, yes or no?
I don't think
so. You refuse to condemn?
No.
You do refuse to condemn?
Why are you putting words in my mouth?
Because you're not condemning it, are you?
What,
I want to understand what differentiates an Israeli in the sky pressing a button, killing the civilians, from somebody in any terrorist organization shooting the people. How could it be that an occupier is defending itself in the first place? The notion that Israel is defending itself is as absurd as the notion that the rapist is defending itself from the victim. Because Israel is the occupier.
You haven't asked me.
Hold on.
But
Excuse me, let me finish. Just let me finish. An occupier by international law definition means that they are already in an offensive posture. If they're in an offensive posture, if someone brings you to Piers Morgan, grabs you by the thing, throws you into your bathroom, you're in your bathroom, you're screaming, and they're eating food, having a good time. One day you come out of your bathroom, you try and fight one of them, who's defending who from who?
Mohammed Hijab does not condemn Hamas. Well, hello again, YouTube. It's been a minute, I'm aware of that. But don't worry, we're back at it, this time tackling a more sensitive topic. Before we get to it, a necessary disclaimer. I realize that the recent course of events can be described as nothing short of tragic, and that emotions, and subsequently biases, run strong on both sides. However, I believe that nothing matters more than the truth, and the truth is impervious to what we believe, what we want to believe, and how strong we feel about what we believe. In short, I don't take sides unless the truth forces me to take sides. I'm saying all this in the likely eventuality that you'll reach a conclusion about my stance before reaching the end of the video. Don't. Watch the entire video and only then decide the box you believe I go into. Today, we will be looking into a talk between Piers Morgan and Mohammed Hijab, but the talk itself isn't the important part. I mean, we'll discuss that as well for a bit, but my main goal is to use this talk as proxy for addressing a larger point, and that would be what it means to condemn civilian deaths. And even more importantly, should you always condemn civilian deaths? Don't worry, I'll justify this point. With this in mind, let's see where these two stand on the issue. Before that though, I need to get this out of the way.
In our religion, we do not believe, as a Muslim, I am a Muslim, and I do not believe in the killing of any man, woman or children, non-combatants. That is not despite the religious teachings, that is because of the religious teachings. So,
how about killing Jews specifically? Because, you see, Jews aren't exactly popular among Muslim scholars, in Islamic teachings, or among the Muslim population in general, and your religion has a lot to say about them. Here's Islam Critiqued explaining this point in his video.
So why does Hamas do what they do? Muhammad established the Jews as mortal enemies. Muslims will fight them until the end. However, even then, Muslims will be so incompetent, kind of like they are now, losing every war that they've fought in since the 20th century, including losing many times to the tiny little state of Israel, that all a Jew needs to do is hide behind a tree or a rock to keep a Muslim from killing him. But miraculously, the trees and rocks will give away the Jews' hiding place so that the incompetent Muslims can come and kill them. That's right, the rocks and trees will say, "O servant of Allah, there is a Jew behind me, so kill him." Of course, there are many verses from the Quran I could cite to you, and many hadith and other sources that inspire perpetual hatred and violence against the Jews. Instead, let's just note that this same hadith is in the Hamas Covenant of 1988. There it is, the talking rocks and trees. The same document states Allah is its target, the Prophet is its model, of course referring to Hamas. The Quran is its constitution, and jihad is its path, and death for the sake of Allah is the loftiest of its wishes. That's convenient because death for Hamas is also the loftiest of my wishes.
I'll link his video in the description. Check him out, he's making really good points. Then, there's the fact that even if we were to ignore the blatant evidence and any trace of common sense and assume that Islam is friendly or at best neutral towards Jews, the people are not. Muslims are not, as you can clearly see here. I mean, it's 50-50 in Israel itself, so, to say that you don't speak for all Muslims would be an understatement. There's also an important note here to be made. You may have noticed that Mohammed used the notion non-combatant, which is fine and dandy, right? He's describing civilians, which he does, but with a twist. I'll get back to this point. Now that we're done with this, where do Piers and Mohammed stand with regards to condemning civilian casualties? Let's have a look at Mohammed first.
Sure.
If, as it seems to me, you believe too, Hamas are not a force for good, do you believe that?
Well, I think that anybody who kills children and those elements of Hamas who are killing children...
Right, so we can agree. So we agree. So what's the difference between what happened on October the 7th and ISIS?
The difference between the Palestinian resistance is the following, okay? Any kind of thing which has Palestinian resistance attached to it. So question, how could it be that an occupier is defending itself in the first place? The notion that Israel is defending itself is as absurd as the notion that the rapist is defending itself from the victim.
Okay, so let's recap. Mohammed only condemns those elements of Hamas who killed civilians, not Hamas as an organization, despite Hamas's politics being literally kill all Jews. Mohammed sees Hamas as representative of the Palestinian resistance, therefore legitimizing Hamas's actions. Mohammed sees Israel as the occupier, comparing it to a rapist, so the aggressor. This means that he sees Hamas's actions as self-defense. Conclusion: Mohammed does not condemn Hamas. Even more importantly, these 3 points bring us back to the notion of non-combatant that Mohammed himself used earlier. And it's a deceiving one because what you mean by it might not be the same as what Mohammed means by it. Because you might understand the combatant as being armed and participating in active combat. But what Mohammed might mean by it is being a settler and occupying a land that isn't yours. In this context, there are no non-combatant Israeli Jews, which coincidentally is exactly what the pro-Palestine mainstream narrative is. Okay, so we know what Mohammed thinks. Let's see what Piers has to say about condemning Palestinian civilian casualties.
Good question.
Hold on, let me ask you a question. Do you condemn the killing of those children by the IDF?
I'll tell you what I condemn.
Yes or no?
I'm going to answer your question honestly and truthfully.
Sure.
I think that what happened on October the 7th was one of the worst atrocities I have ever had to read about or watch on
video. It happens every day in Palestine.
Beautiful. I don't like any civilian death.
Do you mind if I answer
I don't endorse any civilian death.
Well, no. You don't condemn it, though.
Hang on.
Yeah.
No, and here's why. Because I support Israel's right to defend itself.
Beautiful.
Okay, so it's fairly clear that Piers doesn't condemn the civilian deaths. But why? There's 2 reasons for that. On the one hand, he's too emotionally invested in Israel's cause. This means that, in his view, condemning IDF for the civilian deaths would take away from the legitimacy of Israel's actions, which, as he clearly put it, make for a solid case of self-defense. Let's allow Mohammed to help us with the second reason.
I condemn not only Hamas, but any other entity, wherein it's proven that this has been done, that the killing of combatants has been done. Therein, I condemn any party that does it. Any party that kills people or strikes at people where it's more probable than not that it will hit a civilian target, I condemn them. And that's why I condemn the IDF. I want to understand what differentiates an Israeli in the sky pressing a button, killing the civilians, from somebody in any terrorist organization shooting the people.
If it wasn't clear enough, Mohammed is creating a false equivalency. He's putting the intentional targeting of civilians and collateral deaths resulting from aerial bombings on equal footing. And he can only do this by ignoring a critical notion that separates the two, both morally and legally. The notion I'm talking about is intent, which brings us to this video's main topic. There's no doubt that Hamas showed intent when slaughtering civilians in the streets and in their homes. Those were not accidental deaths. They were also not collateral ones. Those civilians could not have been mistaken for military personnel. They were hunted and shot down in their homes in residential areas. They were killed in their cars, jogging in the street, or partying. The intent is clear. Hamas fighters killed everyone they met from the moment they crossed the Israeli border on sight. Those who they chose not to kill, they kidnapped. We have numerous videos recording their crimes, and those are undisputable. Mohammed himself admits and condemns them, which is fine. The problem appears when you draw a parallel between these types of deaths and those resulting from IDF's bombardments. To upgrade those deaths from collateral damages to war crimes, you need to prove intent. You need to prove that the bombing was meant to target civilians and not military installations of any kind if you are to condemn those deaths to the same degree you do for Hamas's victims. And herein lies the problem. It is very difficult to prove intent in this context in an ongoing conflict where both sides have different versions of what's happening. Yes, some rockets landed in residential areas. IDF claims that they're targeting Hamas military objectives that are strategically positioned so that any bombing would necessarily inflict civilian casualties. It's an already well-known Hamas tactic of using civilian human shields to cast a bad light on Israel whenever the inevitable happens. Hamas, on the other hand, claims that IDF intentionally bombs residential areas to inflict genocide on the Palestinians, which is a common rhetoric today. So, what's the truth in this situation? What's the undisputable truth that you can prove as clearly and undeniably as you can prove Hamas's crimes against the Israeli civilians? I would argue that the truth is unattainable in this situation at this moment in time. All you have is speculation based on the available evidence, which is at best contradictory and uncertain. That being said, here are some facts to ponder on. IDF has issued numerous warnings to Gaza residents regarding incoming bombings and urging civilians to leave the targeted areas. Hamas has urged civilians not to leave their homes. And I haven't heard any pro-Palestinian supporter justifying this, knowing full well that the measure will most definitely result in civilian casualties. Hamas is using civilian infrastructure, especially hospitals, to hide military assets. They also fire rockets from residential areas. This makes bombing these assets impossible without some civilian casualties, especially when you consider point 2. So, what should you take away from this video? The essential would be that the notion of condemning civilian deaths has a lot to do with proving intent, especially when one party targets civilians specifically, therefore setting the parameters of what condemning actually means in this context. And no, Mohammed, it's not an action that's more likely than not to result in civilian deaths. It's an action that intentionally aims to cause civilian deaths. Listen, I'm not saying IDF isn't responsible for war crimes. I'm also not saying that their war crimes, if and when proven, are somehow excusable because they've been attacked first. Far from it. War crimes are never excusable. What I am saying is that you need conclusive evidence before upgrading civilian casualties to war crimes. The type of evidence we got in relation to Hamas's actions on October 7. Then I would urge caution and introspection, especially when dealing with complex situations which are bound to ride high emotional waves. Caution because the fog of war is very thick, thicker than ever in the digital era, where disinformation has become a war itself. And introspection because bias is your greatest enemy, not necessarily because it influences the way you think, but because you're not aware it does. Well, that is, unless you're this guy.
You raced in to assume that this was clearly, indisputably, an Israeli airstrike on this hospital. And yet all the evidence now suggests very strongly that it wasn't. That in fact, this was a rocket that misfired coming from a terrorist group inside Gaza. So my question for you is this. Why would you
I wouldn't go that far,
Why
Piers.
would you be... This was your reaction to when the hospital got
I'm
bombed.
a propagandist.
Well, no.
For the record.
I'm not calling
I'm a
you that.
propagandist.
I'm just saying. I'm going to play you.
I'm saying I am.
Okay, well then...
I'm saying I am.
I just
before
want to
you even play it.
Okay.
No. Here's why this is actually an abject failure. And this is not just my perspective on the matter. I'm just a dumb idiot with a Twitch stream who is live reacting to the news and trying to make sense of everything as it's ongoing. I usually have a policy of not covering breaking news, and sometimes that policy is violated. But ultimately, I am not held up by the same journalistic standards, even though I think I do a much better job than most other news outlets in general. So.
got
I'm
bombed.
a propagandist.
Get the fuck out of my sight before I demolish you.
In closing, I'll leave you with Sam Harris.
The most obvious error that people will make now is to imagine that body count is the only measure by which the moral balance swings, right? So if Israel goes into Gaza and inadvertently kills more people than were killed on their side, they've done too much by definition, right? That's wrong in all kinds of ways, but the obvious way that it's wrong is that it completely ignores what people are actually attempting to achieve on both sides, what kind of world they're attempting to build, what their intentions actually are. What would they do if they had more power? If the asymmetric power in the region were reversed, how would Hamas behave vis-a-vis Israel, right? I mean, one thing is obvious. Israel, for decades, if it had wanted to perpetrate a genocide against the Palestinians, could have done that on any given day, right? It would have been trivial. Tomorrow, they could kill everyone in Gaza if they wanted. They obviously haven't wanted that. They obviously don't want to do that now. If you reverse that balance of power and ask, what would Hamas do? What would jihadist organizations anywhere do? They would kill all the Jews.